Here's a situation you've probably lived through. You're wandering around Raccoon City Police Station, minding your own business, just trying to survive. Out of nowhere, a tall and bulky man wearing a trench coat appears, and he starts walking towards you. He keeps following you, and he doesn't stop. His constant presence makes the atmosphere feel heavy with tension at all times. This is Mr. X, and he's going to be your life for a while in Resident Evil 2 Remake. In the remake of Resident Evil 3, a similar experience plays out. You're making your way through downtown Raccoon City when a different bulky man starts chasing you. This man is none other than Nemesis, and he's 10 times worse than Mr. X. Unlike Mr. X, Nemesis doesn't walk at you, he charges at you. He jumps and flies around, cutting you off right when you thought you lost him. He can even use a tentacle whip to grab you and trip you from a distance. By all accounts, Nemesis is everything that Mr. X is, but ramped up to 11. Nemesis is faster, he's stronger, and he's way more lethal. If that's the case though, why is Mr. X more memorable than Nemesis? This just seems like a paradox, and it should be the other way around, but it's not. Mr. X and Nemesis are both classified as tyrants in the Resident Evil universe. When speaking in terms of gameplay, these tyrants serve the same purpose. They're invincible hitmen who hunt you down in non-linear levels, trying to do you in. Mr. X serves this function in RE2 Remake, while Nemesis fills that role in RE3 Remake. Even though Nemesis fits the job description better, Mr. X tends to be the fan favorite of these two. Why is that, exactly? Well, a lot of it actually has to do with the differing genres of both of these games. Also, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to drop the word remake when referring to these games. Resident Evil 2 is a survival horror game, while Resident Evil 3 is an action horror game. This distinction is important since both of them build up your expectations and emotions in different ways. The genre of the game establishes a certain atmosphere. That atmosphere plays into how the game's tyrant is presented and how you react to them. I'll start with explaining Resident Evil 3's action horror, since that genre is easier to understand. In essence, action horror makes you feel like a cool movie hero. You go in guns blazing, ready to crush every monstrosity that stands in your way. You can see this genre reflected in how Resident Evil 3 is designed. While ammo for your guns in this game is limited, you'll virtually always have enough to kill most enemies that you encounter. Not only that, but you also have a dodge move which lets you get out of the way of oncoming attacks easily. If you dodge last second, you'll gain a short burst of invincibility as you dodge. Both the dodge move and the abundance of ammo push you to fight your enemies, if that makes sense. Being well equipped for combat gives you plenty of confidence, but it doesn't give you that much reason to actually be afraid. Those are the defining emotions of action horror: high confidence and low fear. Meanwhile, Resident Evil 2's survival horror is the opposite of that. Survival horror is a genre designed to make you feel low confidence and high fear. It's no secret that Resident Evil 2 barely gives you enough ammo to get by. On top of this, you don't have any fancy invincibility-granting dodge moves, so your mobility is highly limited. This type of design pushes you away from combat. Your main goal in most encounters will be to try to avoid and run away from enemies. That's where the survival part of survival horror kicks in, as you can imagine. Before you even meet either tyrant, these genres already set the atmosphere for the game. RE2's survival horror pushes low confidence and high fear, while RE3's action horror pushes the opposite. Even though both tyrants emphasize survival, the overall tone of the game influences how scary they are. This is part of the reason many players are more afraid of Mr. X than of Nemesis. One of the most important factors in what makes a good horror game is how it plays with your emotions, more specifically, how they play with your sense of tension and shock. These two emotions have a really intimate relationship in horror game design. The game makes a lot of effort to push you towards feeling passive negative emotions, like anxiety and nervousness. These emotions create tension, and that tension gradually builds up over time. At some point, the gameplay hits a climax, and all that tension is immediately converted into shock. Shock consists of intense emotions, like genuine terror. As the game builds up more tension over time, it leads to more fulfilling shock. Mr. X is a masterclass in how to handle tension and shock in horror games. Whenever Mr. X is around and trying to get close to you, those are moments of tension. When he finally closes in on you and punches you, that's his moment of shock. Mr. X spends most of his time slowly walking towards you. This gives you ample time to get away from him, so his tension buildup can be very long. This also means that over time, he's going to build up a lot of anxiety in the player's mind. A while later, you will get caught by Mr. X and he will punch you. This is when all that built-up tension is finally converted into shock. This is the exact moment where all that long-lasting build-up finally pays off. We also have to acknowledge an important nuance here. The pacing of these shock climaxes is really important. Mr. X rarely gets close enough to punch you, but it's important that he does in the first place. If you never get caught by Mr. X, you'll stop being afraid of him, and his presence won't create tension anymore. At the same time, if Mr. X is constantly catching you, there wouldn't be enough time to build up tension between his attacks. They would become so frequent to the point where they don't really shock you anymore. And unfortunately, that's where Nemesis goes completely wrong. Nemesis is much more intense than Mr. X is. He's extremely fast and mobile. It hardly even matters if you're far away from him because he can close that gap in just 2 or 3 seconds. Nemesis is also very lethal, meaning he'll constantly be attacking you and landing hits on you, to the point of actually killing you, repeatedly, many times. If you've played RE3, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. Nemesis encounters have very little time to build up tension, since most of that time is spent in the shock state. And while yes, he's terrifying for the first few minutes you encounter him, your emotions start to gradually burn out. Humans aren't built to be shocked like this so frequently, so we start getting really tired of it. Our immersion is broken and we stop being emotionally invested in the game, which is not good. There can't be any tension build-up and shock payoff in a horror game if we stop caring. That's the issue with Nemesis. He's just Mr. X, but tenfold. That doesn't work though, since Mr. X has a really delicate balance when playing with our emotions. If you overstimulate the variables in that equation, that balance gets utterly shattered, and that's exactly where Nemesis falls flat. There's actually one unique feature that only Mr. X has in all of this, his detection system. Nemesis doesn't have this since he basically knows where you are at all times. Meanwhile, Mr. X feels a lot more dynamic with a searching mode. What I mean by that is, by default, Mr. X doesn't know where you are. He's spending his time actually looking for you. And when I say he's looking for you, I mean it. His AI doesn't cheat by magically pinpointing your location like most enemy AIs do. This adds so much more to your encounters with Mr. X. The only time he starts following you is when he either sees you or hears you. It's just like real hide and seek. While Mr. X still has more power over you than you do over him, his seeking system gives you more control. This engages you with the game a lot more since you're going to be doing things to avoid being detected by Mr. X. You'll take detours in hallways so that he won't see you. You'll try not to sprint around or shoot your weapons such as to avoid making noise he can trace. Playing hide and seek with Mr. X reinforces the survival aspect of this game. However, that's not the most important thing it does. Giving the player this level of engagement and control makes the tension build up more dynamic, which makes the player more invested in it. Meanwhile, the most you can do with Nemesis is just run. This isn't very engaging and it gets boring after a while, which diminishes the player's emotional attachment to the game. Not to mention, getting far away from Nemesis doesn't matter, since he can close that gap by essentially teleporting to you. For Mr. X, it also helps that the level design of the police station is made for hide and seek. There are multiple routes you can take to specific areas, which gives you multiple chances to hide from Mr. X. On top of that, the rooms and corridors of the map are tight and cramped, which is an excellent environment to play hide and seek in. Players can even think ahead by predicting where Mr. X will go next, since he rarely teleports anywhere. He moves around the level realistically, even off-screen. Not only does that add depth to the gameplay, but it also feels so much more immersive. With Nemesis, half the map is just a big and open outdoor area that leaves a lot to be desired. The open fields don't add layers of strategy or nuance to Nemesis encounters. Because of that, they end up feeling very flat and shallow compared to the encounters with Mr. X. By this point, hopefully we have a solid understanding of what Mr. X has that Nemesis doesn't. Let's do a quick recap of what we covered. Genres, tension and shock, and hide and seek. We went over the differences between RE2's survival horror and RE3's action horror. We also talked about how these genres influence the overall tone of their games, and how those tones influence their respective tyrant encounters. For tension and shock, Mr. X does a really excellent job at building tension. His slow movement creates anxiety in the player. All that emotion adds up over time, and once Mr. X finally does catch you, all that tension gets turned into shock. It's a really delicate but ingenious balance. Nemesis, on the other hand, does very little to build tension. Instead, he always tries to put you in a state of shock. This might be scary at first, but the frequency of it eventually burns you out. Thanks to that, you start getting emotionally detached from the game, and that's when it stops being fun. It doesn't help that the threat of Nemesis turns into a complete joke once you learn the timing on your dodge moves to give you invincibility frames. The unfortunate part is that RE3 pushes you towards that, since you won't be able to survive Nemesis encounters otherwise. Again, there's that action game design mindset in play. Mr. X is also unique with his hide-and-seek system, which gets the player much more invested and engaged in Mr. X encounters. The level design of the police station reinforces this system even better. Backtracking is usually a boring point in games, but this turns that into a fun feature, which is a remarkable feat on its own. Although this video has just been centered around Mr. X and Nemesis, I feel a lot of the things we talked about apply to their respective games as a whole. Resident Evil 2 works wonderfully as a survival horror game, and the 97% positive review score on Steam reflects that. Meanwhile, Resident Evil 3 doesn't work very well as an action horror game, as evidenced by its 76% review score on Steam. That's a pretty stark contrast if you ask me. That topic might be worth looking into more down the line, but definitely not in this video. Speaking of this video, we're done with it. If you enjoyed this or found this informative, I would kindly ask that you consider leaving a like or subscribing. It really helps the channel grow, and it lets me know that there's an audience for this sort of thing. If there was something in this video that you disagree with or just want to share your thoughts on, feel free to leave a comment about it. Thank you for watching this, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good one.